class in we will do it virtually. So we were able to do that a little bit. Um, oh yeah, we'll send an email for only virtual. But um, when we really started doing classes online during COVID, they were all not in person, right? And so that's really kind of when we started with this, and it was easy. Um, Doing it like we're doing now, kind of like a hybrid with having some people here in person and some people with us in person and some not in person. It was harder. Are we on, Mike, by the way, on Facebook? Can you see? Let me see. He's always kind of like our checker of this. Um, you know, we were we were we were it allowed us to do a lot more. It allowed me to do things that I hadn't done before. I will tell you that I I'm trying to post the read more about it. The thing that I did last week where I was able to share in the chat the resources and basically links, quick links. I try to find links um, that we were able to you were able to get some more information. Pretty much, I mean, mostly. Some of them were Wikipedia links. Some of them were pretty easy to find. But obviously, if I share a site, I want to make sure that the information's accurate, but also that it's understandable. It's pretty readable, and just lead people down articles that don't make sense. And today, I actually created a couple of handouts, so I'll be able to share those and we'll be able to give those out to people. So um, so welcome everybody again, and let me just check. We have a few more people that have come on. So last week was our introduction, talking about the overview and talking about um, what it is to be Jewish, or what is a Jew really, um, to kind of define an undefinable term and to try to understand something that really defies easy explanation. And so we decided to do that again with today's topic, which is God, which is another toughie. So we are beginning with some hard stuff. But as we talked about last week, what is a Jew? One of the ways that we sometimes define Judaism is that three pronged or three-sided chair, which is three-legged chair, which is the God, Torah, and Israel. And so we're really kind of talking about the first of those three today, God, which is definitely one of the ways that we define ourselves is as a people. But what's interesting is that um, it's been said, and I don't think it's incorrect to say that Jewish people don't talk a lot about God. We definitely rabbis don't talk a lot about God. We don't talk a lot about God, about the subject of God with each other, and it doesn't come up a lot. I was going to say he doesn't come up a lot, but that's probably, again, part of the problem, which is that the terms that we use for God are oftentimes gender specific. In Hebrew and in Jewish tradition, it was very common for there to be gender specific names for God because every noun in Hebrew is a gender identity, just like it is in Spanish and other languages where there are genders on on nouns and on verbs. Because remember, in Hebrew grammar, you it will be either male or female. The only word that's not a gender in in Hebrew is I. And so if you speak about the I in the first person, then there's no gender. But most of the Bible, a lot of the Bible, and a lot of the texts about God early on in the Bible and and in Jewish literature and later on in the Talmud and Midrash, you're going to find male terms, but you don't only find male terms for God. But because of that, most of the translations we see that talk about God in Hebrew are male. And so oftentimes see the translation of God as he. In most modern translations, including our prayer book, for example, the prayer book that I put together 25 years ago, I tried to avoid all gender specific names for God. It's almost completely absent from our Siddur. And most of the translations that I use will use the word God rather than the word Lord, and will not use the word he. It's tough, and sometimes I won't, because it makes the translation not really make sense. But I think one of the things that I try to do, at least when I'm when I'm working with God, if you will, that I mean that in a lot of different ways, is I try not to create distinctions or definitions that will make people feel disconnected, right? So one of the things that I try to do is not to do that. And I think there are a lot of rabbis that do that, a lot of cantors, people who are leading tefillah and prayers. It's just interesting. I just had a conversation this morning. I was talking with Joe Buchanan, one of my favorite musicians and somebody that I've introduced to a lot of people. He's going to Israel with us in November, and he's a great musician. And I was talking to him about he just released a new version. He's just released a new album, and he was promoting it over the last couple of days. It's an album of Jewish music called Heaven and Earth that is kind of liturgy focused. And he has his Hashkivenu on there, which is wonderful. He actually sang it here. He's sung it before. It's not a new song necessarily, but it's the first time he released it like this. And when he sings it, he uses the words in the Hashkivenu. He uses the words Shomrenu for God, which means our guardian. And then he also sometimes, in this version that he just released, he uses the word Malkenu. And so I asked him, I said, I noticed that you're using the words Shomrenu and Malkenu in the Hashkivenu. And he goes, yeah. He goes, I did it. I've been doing it lately that way. It's interesting because when Rick and Addie do the Hashkivenu here, they also use the word Shomrenu, which is it takes guardian, which is what Shomrenu means, our guardian, takes away the word implication of the word melech, which means king. Now, king is not the only way you can translate the word melech. As a matter of fact, if you look at the translations in the Siddur that I use, that I created and adapted, I use the word ruler for king instead, which is a non-gendered title for God the ruler. And so you can use a word for God, a title for God that isn't gender specific. But then in some cases, again, it's a word like melech, which some people will just say, that's a man. Same thing with the word, and we're going to come up to it in a few weeks at Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Avinu, right? Avinu Malkenu. There you have both, right? Our Father, our King. Well, you can also translate it as our parent and our ruler. Now, it doesn't sound as poetic necessarily, our parent and our ruler, but it's definitely much more inclusive from the standpoint of you're not making God a gender. And I think that that's part of the challenge, is what names and what we call God. And I'm going to take you now through that journey of that, because guess what? That starts in the Bible. So I will just say again, for one other point of introduction and clarity, the Jewish people, to some extent, introduced God to the world. And by that, I mean a concept of God that was different than any other concept of God that existed before. Namely, a God that doesn't have a body, a God that isn't a gender, God that isn't very much like a person, and maybe even, by the way, a God that doesn't have some animal characteristics as well. Yeah, we introduced a God that was not going to be contained by those kinds of things. Ever since maybe about 2,000 years ago, and again, we'll talk about it when we get into the subject. One of the upcoming classes will be about Christianity. Once we had, I think, once we had a kind of a competing monotheistic faith, we really stopped talking a lot about God, partly because we were afraid to, because we had a religion that was our more powerful sibling, and then, of course, our child, if you will. And then, of course, we had Islam as well later on, 600 years later, where we had to be very careful the way we spoke about God because our lives depended on it. And we had to be a little careful about how we spoke about God. And then I think there was also this issue, especially in the last 200 years, when Judaism started confronting rational thought and science and the Enlightenment period, where people stopped thinking that, again, this God that we introduced to the world, are we going to sound stupid talking about God in the face of science? And so, interestingly, as Jews became leading voices in science, the idea of talking about God became even more difficult. And so, I it's nothing if not ironic that the people that introduce God to the world are the ones who feel most uncomfortable talking about God. So we're going to talk about God today. And again, we go back to the Bible. And I will tell you right off the bat, um, I'm very careful not to, and I promise we'll get there, I'm very careful that as I talk about some of this, that I'm not necessarily saying these are my theological beliefs, and that I am very careful that I don't make people feel uncomfortable with something that I would say is my belief and it would not be somebody else's belief. But I promise we'll get back to that. But first, does that make sense to everybody? So I just want to make that real clear right off the bat. This is a subject that is very personal to people, and that's a good thing. I mean, that kind of should be the way it is, at least from at least part of what we're going to talk about today, I hope, and something that you will feel. So let's take a look at the beginning, shall we? Actually, let's take a look at the very beginning, which is Bereshit, Genesis. And so when the Bible begins, and if the Bible is anything, and some people have argued, it's a book about God. Now, of course, it's also about us. It's about us as people, as humans, and also to some extent us as Jews. And that relationship is something we're going to be talking about, defining God to some extent in the relationship that we have with God, both as humans to some extent and also as Jews. But the Bible begins in Bereshit at the very beginning, in chapter 1, with the words that God created heaven and earth. And the word that's used for God here is the name Elohim. And we have, very interestingly, two different names for God in the Bible almost right away. In chapter 1, there's a God who creates heaven and earth. And he's creating a heaven and earth very much out of what God would do, which is make a heaven and earth, we'd think, and form things, right? Make light, make energy, make water, etc. What's interesting is that we have another story in Genesis that comes right after in chapter 2, where we have a God who is called something else. And that is a God who is referred to by another name, which is Yud-He Vav-He, a name that we traditionally don't even pronounce. And in this version, Adonai Elohim, and both names are used, the Lord God, and that's why it's translated as God Adonai here, because they didn't use the word Lord, they just use the word Yud-He Vav-He. They use the unpronounceable name for God, the name that is incorrectly translated as Jehovah, but that's not the way it's pronounced because there's no J in Hebrew. But That's the name that, close to the name that is the name of God. And we can see that in this story, it's actually God kind of making a human being first. And that this God literally blows life into that first human. And in this version of a story of creation, there's a God who is interacting with human beings, not so much as a creator, but almost as a parent. Which is why when we come to the high holidays and we talk about Avinu Malkeinu, we talk about our parent and our ruler, we have this dichotomy in Jewish theology and Jewish belief of God, that God is, on one hand, creating things on a macro level, on a cosmic level. And again, the Hebrew Bible really talks about creation kind of the earth and of the planets. But by extension, it's very easy. And again, most traditional Jews have no issue understanding that the universe is much larger than our solar system, is much larger than one galaxy even. But then we also have a God who literally blows life into the first person's nose. Yeah, well, humans capitalized because it says ha-adam, the human. And Adam here is going to be translated throughout the second version as the human. In the first version of the story, in the first version, it simply says that God created humankind. Of course, in this first version of the story, man and women are created at the same time. So they are slightly different versions of the story. I would say maybe even not so slightly different versions of the story, but it shows you that we have two kind of versions of God right away. Both of them are God that are creator, by the way. Both of them have God making things, but God is working on a different level. God is working at a very human connected level versus a God who makes man and woman, but make this man. This man he forms out of the clay and then breathes life into it, literally like breathing it alive. And I think most people don't realize that version of God is a lot different than this version of God that you see right here, which is also, hey, God creates us in the divine image, but God also is maybe a little bit more distant. And again, we won't talk about it now, but we will talk about it soon because one of the next classes we're doing is about the Torah, and we will talk a little bit about the theories of why there are two versions of the creation story, both the traditional answer to that and the more scientific answer to why there's two different versions of the story. And I've talked about some of this before, but again, one of the classes coming up will be that story about the Bible itself. So folks, we've got this version here of Genesis, but rather than like focusing on the fact that, okay, so we have two different versions in Genesis and their creation stories, there's another issue too, which is that at the beginning of the story and throughout Genesis, God starts talking to people and communicating with people directly, including Noah and including, very importantly, our first family, which includes Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And it also includes Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, Leah, Bilhah, and Zilpah, all the matriarchs and patriarchs. And what's interesting, of course, is that God talks to the women as well, almost immediately. God talks to women because he talks to Rebecca and he lets her know that she's got two nations inside her. And so women do talk to God almost immediately. But the conversations with God, especially the ones in the book of Genesis, are for the most part, they're one-sided conversations where God will tell somebody something. The difference, of course, is Abraham who starts to argue with God, and we'll come back to that idea of Abraham arguing with God. It's a pretty substantial a step, which is that God talks to us and we can respond. But the greatest conversations that God has in the Bible, and for that matter, I mean, I mean, I don't want to ruin the story, but in the Christian Bible as well, for Christians, God does not have conversations in the Bible with anybody, with the same familiarity and the same frequency as this guy.
Awesome.
And so, and so Moses talks to God all the time. And he has conversations, and he sometimes argues with God. And the very first time he meets God is at the burning bush in chapter 3 of Exodus. And if you look at what happens here, God appears to him in a burning bush, which doesn't seem like a great way of capturing someone's attention, but not the most dramatic, but it teaches us a lesson that God will sometimes talk to us in the least expected places. And of course, Moses says to him very famously, Hineni, here I am. He's not the first person to say to God, Hineni, because of course, Abraham says the same thing, Hineni. But coincidentally, by the way, Adam doesn't say Hineni, the first person, or Eve, who also, by the way, I should say, talks to God. Eve talks to God, right? And then there's Noah, who doesn't talk to God at all. God tells him what to do and just does it. But Abraham does say Hineni, and of course here Moses says Hineni. And when God speaks to Moses, God kind of, I don't want to say God introduces, right? And God's self. And God says, I am the God of your father's house, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. Elohe Avraham, Elohe Yitzhak, Elohe Yaakov. Keep that in mind because we're going to come back to that. Sounds familiar, right? And it says Moses hid his face. He was afraid. And then God says, I see what's happening to my people in Egypt. I'm going to get them out, right? And this is your job. And of course, you're going to free them. Moses says, who am I, right? He argues with him, right? He starts to say, I shouldn't be the person. And then Moses challenges God with an interesting question, which is, when I come to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your father's house has sent me, they're going to ask me, what is God's name? What shall I say to them? Which tells us that at least in Egypt by this point, they might have forgotten what exactly God was, or God, who is God at this point? And this is one of the most powerful lines about God that we have, because God here describes God's self. So God is now going to say, what am I supposed to be called? And God said to Moses, Ehyeh asher ehyeh, which here in this translation doesn't even translate it. It just transliterates it, continuing, thus shall you say to the Israelites, Ehyeh sent me to you. That's what God tells him to call him. Now we know that the word Yud-He Vav-He is a version of this word, Ehyeh, right? What does it mean? Well, we don't know for sure. It's a tough word to translate, or tough words to translate. Ehyeh, asher, yeh. Well, one of the words is the same, right? Ehyeh, and the word asher, which means am or will, or be, or that. It's part of the verb of being, asher. Goes along with it. We use it all the time. Asher kidshanu, that or which. So that, the word asher could be that or which. But the word ehyeh is the tough one, right? Because how do we translate it? Is I am or I will be. However you translate it, the translation uses it as consistent. So that if it is I am that I am, ehyeh asher ehyeh, or I am who I am, or I will be what I will be, usually are translated like that. But it also could be I am what I will be, or I will be what I am. If you're going to translate it, the same, that makes sense. The word ehyeh is the same word, but it doesn't have to be translated that way. And we normally do. Most of the translations, if you look in the Bible, will King James says, I am that I am. But the interesting thing is it can be, I will be what I will be. That might actually be a better translation. That God literally introduces God's self to Moses and says, I'm not fully what I will be, which for some people will seem kind of mind blowing, but that God isn't fully developed yet. That the position and the existence of God is yet to be fully realized. So, oh no, no, that is a possibility. I heard that God, God could also be telling him, you don't understand what I am yet, or I, I, I haven't told you everything yet. Yeah, you haven't seen everything yet. It's definitely a possibility. All of those are possibilities. Definitely, if we understand it as it's still going to happen, that it's a future tense type situation, which I believe it can be. I mean, it maybe even can make you argue should be, because in Hebrew, an aleph before a word is future tense, right? So if you say, I will go somewhere, you put an aleph before it, a lech, I will go. Um, so yeah, a yeah is very easily the future. But if it's I am what I am, then God is just simply saying I am what I am, right? So if you translate it in the present tense, then it's a little bit more I am. What are you talking about? I am what I am. What are you talking about? You don't know what I am? I am what I am. So it could also be somewhat accusatory, which is I am, and when he finally says to Moses, like, well, what do you call me? I am. Or you could also say, I will. Because he says, yeah. Now again, it could be tell them yeah, you know. You could just say yeah, or you could just say the full name, yeah, Asher yeah. So this is an interesting idea. Because when God finally kind of says, this is what you should call me, that's what God says. So just understand, if we continue to call God by that name, which we could, because that's what God says the name is, then there's still this idea that God's reality is not something that we can uh, ever really maybe even fully know, but that this is another level of well, you could say God's unknowability. But we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about that in a moment. Yeah, this is going to be tough to get to everything today. But I want to show you one other thing from the Torah, which is another line that you know very well. I'm not saying you guys don't know the burning bush really well. You do. I'm not saying you don't. But you know this line really well. And the reason why you know it really well is because we're supposed to say this line every single day. We're actually supposed to say it the first thing we do when we wake up. Right here. Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. And if you, by the way, if you look here, they said, there is a couple different ways to translate that too. Um, and we know, again, in Hebrew, the word Shema means listen or hear, right? Pay attention. May not necessarily mean literally just hear, but pay attention. This was in last week, Torah portion 2 weeks ago. Yisrael, well, you know what that is. That's us. The next couple of words are tough to translate in the sense that, again, it's the name of God. How we translate it, they don't translate it at all. They just use the transliteration. They don't transliterate it. They just use the Hebrew word in this, but it's usually translated as Lord. And then, of course, we have the word Eloheinu, which means our God, Elohim Shalanu. And then we have this last word, which is Echad, which here they translated it as alone. And of course, you know it better as this translation, the Lord is one. Now, look, some people focus on the fact that this seems to be talking to us, to Israel, to the people of Israel, that this is your God. And some people have said, and they've said this throughout history, that this is a commandment for us as Jews to understand that God is our God alone. That the commandment here isn't really so much that God is only one, which is maybe hinted at by this more scientific translation, which is you're only supposed to worship God. Which, of course, leads some people to the conclusion that at this time, it's not necessarily that the Jews didn't believe that there were other gods, but they were supposed to only worship one God and only this God, Adonai. That's a possibility. And it is a possibility that maybe there was a time when Jews said, well, we don't care what God you're worshiping, but we only worship one God. We worship only Adonai. Some people call that not monotheism, they call it henotheism, which is an idea that there's a God that you worship and that's your God, and there might be other gods, but that Jews weren't initially fully monotheistic. And for people who believe that, they look at things in the Torah in a different way, which is that God seems to be covenanting, having a relationship with us, but not necessarily other people. I would say that's problematic because God created everything, right? God created at the beginning. If God created all of humanity, then God is the God for everybody. Yeah.
That at ancient times had figurines.
Yes. Yes. And so what Philip just said is, haven't we learned? Yes. And we read it in the Bible. It's not just archaeology tells us this. The Bible tells us that Israelites were constantly worshiping other gods. And part of the issue, of course, is that, and we have to keep this in mind as we talk about God, is that our concept of God is constantly being shaped by the people around us as well. Our theology, our belief system, our practices are always informed by the people around us. Always. And so the idea that Judaism went through a period where it was difficult for us to separate our understanding of God from the other gods was such that maybe the Shema is just telling you, stop worshiping those other gods. Now, one can make the argument, yeah, but if there's only one God to begin with, doesn't that make it easier? Let's not play around anymore. There are no other gods. And so we start to see that in the Bible itself. And I want to tell you, look, this is a major argument amongst theology students. It definitely is an issue within the Christian community because there are people who say that initially the Jews weren't fully monotheistic, and they really don't become monotheistic until the prophetic period, until the time of the prophets. And why is that important? Because the later that Jews develop monotheism, the more it is that they weren't really that much, they weren't monotheistic much earlier than Christians. Like, they know we invented monotheism. They're not denying that. But what they kind of say is that we came to it much later than we'd like to think we were. Like, people during Moses' time were not all monotheistic. And again, we know they weren't because the Bible says they were worshiping other gods, but they weren't supposed to be. And if that's because they're not supposed to be worshiping other gods, is that because there are no other gods or because we're only supposed to worship one God? Again, it sounds like we're splitting hairs nowadays because we're surrounded by people who are, I would say, monotheistic. They're reading our Bible. But when you're surrounded by people who are pagans, who are all worshiping idols, you look like an idiot when you're not worshiping an idol. So there were a lot of Jews who said, I'm not an idiot. My neighbor worships idols. I better worship an idol too. Oh, yeah, there's definitely an argument that it's easier to have multiple gods. It was especially easier. We know it was easier, Philip, when there were everybody worshiped multiple gods. We don't live like that today. When we did, I guarantee you it was harder. And again, we'll talk about when we get to Christianity, because we are going to talk about Christianity in light of, how do we understand Christianity? It's coming up. It's one of the subjects in our class. look, to some extent, Christianity, I believe, made a concession to polytheism. I don't think it's idolatry. I mean, some people have argued that Christianity is idolatry. I don't believe it's idolatry. I know enough about the way what most Christians believe, and I have enough friends who are Christian, and I know they're not idolaters. There was a time when both Judaism and Islam thought Christianity was idolatry because there were statues of Jesus in the
This the
churches.
new kid?
What?
Right.
Oh,
Okay.
and so, but the issue is does Christianity make
So
us?
Latanya came out in the fourth?
1 second, Joyce, you got to mute. Um, that that Christianity made some concession to polytheism, to a belief in more than one God. But here, I want to direct your attention to one of our prophets. And again, this is where we start to see very clearly in the book of Isaiah, of course, Christians look at the book of Isaiah because they believe it foretells Jesus. So when you see words in Isaiah, Christians will oftentimes get excited because they're saying, oh, yeah, this is the book that starts to talk about Jesus. I mean, we would say it doesn't, but whatever. I mean, that's a belief system that's a little different. But look at what Isaiah says, and this is towards the end of the book of Isaiah, the last section of Isaiah. And look at what God tells Isaiah. God's prophecy to Isaiah, what the words that Isaiah is supposed to tell the people. It is too little that you should be my servant, in that I raise up the tribes of Jacob and restore the survivors of Israel. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to restore the people. They're going to come back, and we're reading about that, by the way, on Tuesday mornings right now, the book of Ezra, the return of the Jews from exile. But here's what God says. I will also make you a light of nations. You've heard that phrase before. This is where it comes from, Isaiah. Or Lagoyim. You will be the light to the nations, that my salvation may reach the ends of the earth. Which, of course, the word Yeshua, which is what the Christians follow a man named Yeshua, which means salvation. That's one of the reasons why it became, attached. I mean, we don't think about that, but that's what the name Joshua or Yeshua means, God's salvation. I will make you the light of nations, that my salvation will reach the ends of the earth, that my presence. So you can see that God is now talking about it. And again, Isaiah is the spokesperson for this idea, is saying that God will be the God who will touch everything, everybody. Everyone will have a chance to come to God, interestingly, through the Jewish people. So this is where our relationship with God becomes interesting, because we're now the spokesperson for God. That's what it says. And I would argue we were for a long time. We still kind of are, because our Bible has been translated into every language, and that passage has been translated to every language. But if you think about it, and if you're not Jewish, I mean, technically speaking, you don't have to be a light to the nations unless you're a Jew. But it's one of our responsibilities. And I will tell you that this is also one of the books that we also will be turning to in just a few weeks, is this great guy that we learn about, our friend Jonah. Now, Jonah, of course, is mostly a story. It's a very short story. It's only 4 chapters, and we'll read Jonah on Yom Kippur afternoon. We always read it. But I always like to remind people, and we go through it kind of fast, is that when Jonah is first in trouble in chapter 1 on the ship, when it's getting stormy all around him, the ship, the captain and the crew are being tossed around. Their lives are in jeopardy. And what do they try to do? They try to, Jonah tells them, you have to throw me overboard because I'm the reason for this. And they say, we don't want to throw you overboard. And they actually pray to God. They cry out to God, oh, please, Eternal One, do not let us perish on account of this man's life. Do not hold us guilty of killing an innocent person. For you, O Eternal One, by your will have brought this about. And they threw him overboard, and the sea stopped raging. And then it says, the men feared God greatly, and they offered a sacrifice to God, and they made vows. Now, what's interesting about that story is it shows that these people on the ship, who were not Jewish, right? We know they're not Jewish because it says right away, it says, how can you be sleeping? Call upon your God, right? We already read about that. It's actually not the first time he says it. They said, in their fright, each cry out to his own God. We know they don't worship God at first. They experience this miracle, and then they become believers in God. And so the book of Jonah is one of the first places that we see. And again, we know that Ruth converts to Judaism. We read about the story of Ruth converting, who's, King David's great grandmother was a convert to Judaism. But we read about this whole group. They're not converting because they're part of a Jewish family. They're not converting because they're in the family. These are people who saw God and become Jewish. I mean, this is a story to some extent about Gentiles embracing Judaism. That's the last part of our Bible I'm going to show you. Now, I could show you, and I don't need to show you because you know it, and I don't need to tell you. What differentiates the Hebrew Bible from the Christian Bible primarily is the idea that changes in the Christian Bible, which is that everybody, Jewish or Gentile, has an equal stake in the relationship with God. And one could make the argument that Jews already believed it. You see it in the book of Jonah, but in the Christian Bible, it's a cornerstone of what goes on there, which is that it doesn't matter. And there's some very famous lines from some of the books, like one of the quotes from the book of Romans, where Paul literally says, Jew or Gentile are equal now. Now, that concept is not necessarily what you get from Isaiah, right? Where Jews are meant to be the Or Goyim, and we kind of know that many of Jesus's earlier followers thought, no, if you want to be a part of this pact, if you want to be a part of this group, you got to be a Jew. But by the time of Paul, no, you don't have to be a Jew anymore. But the relationship with God changes already in the book of Jonah, and it definitely changes in Christianity. And of course, to some extent, the relationship with that God changes because God changes. And Judaism, of course, can't embrace that idea. Judaism can't embrace the idea that God has any other form, and especially to some extent, one would say a concession to this idea that God is a human being, that God is a man. Now, again, it's not my faith, and I don't have to justify it, and I don't have to explain it. But the concept of Trinity then becomes a difficult one for Jews to accept because it seems to be a difficult step to try to explain, and we don't have to try to explain it. I will tell you, and we're going to look at it right now, it doesn't necessarily mean that our definitions of God don't sometimes get complicated, and we'll take a look at this. Because as we move forward into the Talmud, and we spent a lot of time over the last couple of years reading the Talmud and reading the Midrash, and we spent a lot of time in text. By the time of the Talmud, which is the time of Christianity, the early part of the Talmud was the time when Christianity was formed, Judaism is really trying to establish the fact that God is there, even in the darkest times, and especially dealing with the destruction of the Second Temple by the Romans. How can God allow these kind of things to happen? Which of course, I'm going to get to as well. But there's no question that the destruction of the temple 2,000 years ago was a pivotal moment in Jewish history. We'd already had our temple destroyed, but now we have our temple destroyed, and we're not coming back to it like we did before after 70 years. It takes us 2,000 years to come back to Israel and rebuild. It's a long time. It's not 70 years. It's 2,000 years. And we also suffered tremendously during that period of time. And now, of course, there's another religion that's a monotheistic religion that's competing and is in that marketplace of ideas. And so in the Talmud, we start to see to some extent, and we looked at it, and we'll talk about it a little bit when we get to Christianity, an attempt for Judaism to kind of differentiate our view of God from Christianity and from what other people are starting to talk about God. But one of the most important things is that God is still there, even in our absence of autonomy in the land of Israel. And remember, the destruction of the temple was the Holocaust and the destruction of Israel wrapped together. I mean, you cannot imagine the trauma that happened to us. We can because we know the Holocaust, but imagine the Holocaust and Israel being destroyed to us, for us, what that would mean. Both the vast destruction of human life and also the destruction of our political and religious autonomy, being able to control our future. I mean, that's really what happened. In the Holocaust, we lost so many people, but we didn't have autonomy. We didn't have our own homeland. We didn't have a place we could call our own. That look, we lost all of those synagogues and all those communities in Poland, Ukraine, and all those places were destroyed. But we were guests in those places when our own homeland got destroyed. But yet the rabbis continued to believe, and they continued to assert that God, even though this was tremendously difficult, and I mean, that's an understatement. It's how do we even continue? And they asked that question. They believed that God was just and that God wasn't gone. God didn't die. And hold that thought, because when we get to, in a few minutes, the discussion about the Holocaust, we start to ask different questions. So God is still there. By the time of the Middle Ages, and by the time we have, and I know I'm skipping ahead a lot, about 1,000 years, during the time of the Middle Ages, we now not only have Christianity, we also have Islam. And Islam actually asserts, to some extent, the Jewish view that there is only one God. And they are very strong about that. To some extent, the Muslims felt, look, we're going to reassert this idea of one God, and we think the Jews will find this attractive because they don't like Christianity. They don't accept Christianity, but they'll accept our form of monotheism. And Muhammad really feels and hopes that the Jews will convert to Islam. And some of them did, obviously. Many of them did, especially, under force. They had no choice. But a lot of them didn't, and he didn't like that. And so he starts turning on the Jewish people. And some of the worst parts of the Quran against Jews are after the Jews prove that they're not going to convert to Islam. And that drives them crazy. What's interesting, again, is this phenomenon is repeated again as we come out of the Middle Ages in Protestant history, not theology necessarily, though it spills over. And that is that when Martin Luther starts his new form of Christian thought, we call Protestantism and the Reformation, he makes a big attempt at trying to get Jews to embrace that faith. And he's successful. He gets some Jews to take on Christianity in Germany, in that part of the world. But there were a lot of Jews who were still a little suspect of the faith. And of course, when that happens, Martin Luther turns on the Jews and becomes very anti-Semitic. So a similar thing happens when Jews don't follow, that the reaction becomes pretty bad. So Martin Luther's first attempt to try to get Jews to follow along is really well intended, but again, the reaction that happens after they don't becomes very violent. And to some extent, one could say some of the seeds of the anti-Semitism in Germany and those countries is part of the legacy of what Martin Luther starts to say about the Jewish people. So this is not just theology. This becomes our history, and this becomes, unfortunately, sometimes why we get killed. So, yeah, people think we're going to come along if they make a little different. I mean, Martin Luther's argument was a good one, which is, hey, Jews, we understand you don't want to become Catholic because of the Crusades and because of the Inquisition that just happened, right? We know that we're not selling Christianity very well to you. That's what he essentially says. But we're changing that. But they still don't come. And when that happens, it gets bad. And again, you understand the psychology of it, which is, what do you mean you're not joining my team? And then you get mad at the people who don't join your team. But skipped a little bit over one of the things I want to talk about during the Middle Ages, which is Islam and Christianity and what effect that had, again, because Judaism never, our theological ideas, our relationship with God is always informed by the people around us. And in the Middle Ages and during this early, kind of experiences with Judaism and Islam in the face of Christianity, is we have this amazing rabbi in North Africa, originally born in Spain, and that's Maimonides, the Rambam, Maimonides, Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon. And he comes up with an interesting approach to God. He was a brilliant man. He's one of the guys that I'm going to give you some articles you can read more about. And he comes up with a very interesting theology, a way of approaching God, which is definitely informed by his Muslim environment that he's a part of. He's very rational. He's a scientist. He's a doctor. He's a philosopher who tries to understand God in a rational way. In many ways, kind of the way later people will try to approach God by, let's be rational about God. Well, God created a world that seems to have order. I mean, God must work in that order. And so what Maimonides starts to do is he starts to attempt to describe God in a way that rational people can understand God, not through things that defy logic, but by science, by the scientific world. He was very informed by the Muslims had started reintroducing classical Greek philosophy, Plato, Socrates, Aristotle, but especially Plato and Aristotle. These people who wanted to understand, like, how does the universe work? And so he said, it's better, Maimonides, to summarize it, he basically said, we can't talk about what God is, because any way that we try to define God as human beings is going to limit God. And the best thing we can do is talk about what God isn't. God isn't human. God isn't time-bound. God isn't confined to one type of existence. And so Maimonides starts to talk about God. We call it a negative theology, but that sounds like he's being negative. He's just saying no. We just can say, no, God is not this. God is not this. No, God's not that. And so that's what Maimonides starts to do. And this has a profound effect on later Jewish thought. Some people feel like it's groundbreaking. I would say that he definitely based it on some earlier Jewish ideas, and he's definitely opening up for the future for Jews to approach God as rational as we can. For people who, I want a rational God. I want a God that I can explain the world with, a system. But at the same time that he's writing this, and at the same time he's starting to kind of teach this very rational, and again, to some extent, informed by Muslim theologians, who, by the way, I know it sounds different and difficult for us to imagine in our world today, but at the time, 1,000 years ago, the cities where the greatest learning was going on were Muslim cities. They were Cordoba and Damascus, Baghdad. These were the centers of learning. They were not London. They were not Amsterdam. They were not Paris. They were not any city in Germany. It was those cities. And those were places where Jews, Christians, and Muslims were all working together, coming up with great strides in science and preserving some of the ancient information, but really trying to push the envelope for science. It's an amazing time, and it was 1,000 years ago, literally 1,000 years ago. I'm talking about like 1050. At the same time, though, we have another trend that's developing, which is Kabbalah. And we're going to talk about Kabbalah in session, probably a couple sessions, the ideas for Kabbalah. But the Kabbalistic ideas start in the Torah and develop in the Talmud, and we can see some of those things developing. But by the time we get into the Middle Ages, especially the later Middle Ages, we start to actually see some of the works that come out of this period and come out of the same area that Maimonides is working in, Spain and North Africa. We start to see the Zohar and some of the Kabbalistic works, which actually go a different direction than Maimonides, which is let's try, even if we use negative terms. In some cases, the Kabbalah does use terms that God is not. For example, God is the most common name for God in the Zohar is Ein Sof. God is without end. Ein Sof, no end. But even if we're going to talk about that, we're still going to try to, and Maimonides wasn't really concerned with this, we're going to try to, through Jewish mystical practices, access God as much as we can. We want to feel God and we want to experience God as much as we can. And we want to say that God is present here all over the place. Now, it's not, that's why I say it's not opposite of what Maimonides was doing, but it was, maybe it was complementary, but it had a different approach, which is Maimonides wanted to create an agreement between science and religion, where the Kabbalah is really trying to say, how can we experience God? How can we feel God? which is why Kabbalah has always been um, has always been interesting to some people, also scary for some people, because mysticism in any form kind of starts to open up this idea that God can be controlled. And so one of the things that Kabbalah becomes to some people is another form of magic. And this was something that the rabbis who lived in North Africa, and including Maimonides, didn't really speak that much about Kabbalah, but he spoke about some of what was happening in Kabbalah. He did not like things like amulets. He didn't like things like incantations. He didn't like things that attempted to control God. And some of the Kabbalistic items and thoughts, and to some extent, some of the applications of practical Kabbalah, if you will, become to him and to other people too magical. And so you start to see people say, both Maimonides and later philosophers who were inspired by his rational approach to Judaism, one of the most important things, and again, I don't want to, we can't get into it too much today, but one of the most important concepts in Kabbalah is this idea of sphirot, of emanations. And in Kabbalah, and you can see it sometimes in the artwork, and I'll again put some links up for Kabbalistic, some of the things that we've seen, and you see it in Sfat, in the city of Sfat in northern Israel, is that there's 10 names for the divine emanations, or the sphirot, that God kind of created. And Maimonides and his followers said, look, if you're going to talk about sphirot, which are these 10 qualities of God, if you will, and we'd call them qualities, they're not existences of God, but 10 ways of accessing God, including things like God's power, God's Tiferet, God's beauty, God's judgment, all of these ideas, Din, Chokhmah, all of these things. By the way, the word Chabad is a acronym of Chokhmah, Bina, and Da'at, three of those emanations, three of those sphirot. We don't think about it, but every time we say Chabad, we're using the acronym Chokhmah, Bina, Da'at. Those are the three intellectual things attached to it, wisdom, discernment, and knowledge, if you will. But some of Maimonides and his followers said, look, we don't want Christians to follow, or no, we don't want Christians. We object to Christians having a Trinity. Now you're having 10. You want to replace the 3 of God with 10 of God? That's even worse. So they understood that you got to be careful, because you don't want to replace a concept of one God with multiple ways of accessing God. So this is something that we also start to see during the Middle Ages, and continues to some extent, this tension between accessing God and at the same time trying to create a God who makes sense to us as we become more and more exposed to enlightenment and ideas that will challenge us to some extent, and as of course, for some people, lead to full-on atheism. So Maimonides is very well known for the Guide to the Perplexed, one of the most famous of his tractates, but he also wrote legal codes. His legal code is amazing. He wrote about lots of subjects, commentaries on the Torah, but I'm going to show you a chart in 1 second, because there's one more person that I'm going to introduce to you before. Because as we go through the Middle Ages, then as that period kind of comes to an end, which people date that differently, but we're talking, different aspects of history. But what really we would say, when we get into the Renaissance period and we get into this period of now confronting and accepting ideas of science, and also as Jews are no longer necessarily, in some cases, starting to be forced to live in ghettos. Remember, the Jews weren't allowed back in England until 1660s. They weren't allowed to live there for 400 years. When they're allowed to come back to countries, in some places in France and some places in Germany, where no Jews were even allowed to live since essentially the Crusades, as they start to come back to Western Europe, and then Western Europe goes through these changes, we see Enlightenment and rationalism take hold, which is a challenge, of course, to the church, and later on, of course, churches, because we have Catholic and Protestantism. But one of the the theologians, one of the people who starts talking about God in very different ways, was a Jew and was also very important for Christians. And that is a guy who came out of the Sephardic community, but who lived in Holland. And his name was Baruch Spinoza. And you've heard of Spinoza before because he is an interesting guy from our take. He was a Jewish guy who got thrown out of the community. As a 24-year-old, he's excommunicated. He must have been a brilliant guy. I mean, we know his work because it was preserved by philosophers during this period of the 17th century. He's very well respected by Christian theologians and people who try to understand God and try to understand God in terms of, okay, we're opening up the world. The world isn't flat, right? The world is round. We can sail around the world. We understand there's more and more people in the world that we're coming into contact with. It's opening our eyes. And Spinoza argues for another view of God, which is informed, no question, by his Sephardic history, by Maimonides and by the people who came before him, who were rationalists. And he starts to say, look, God isn't. He uses Maimonides kind of as a launching point, but he starts to say that God, we can't think of God as a guy with a beard who makes things and who is different from creation. God is everywhere. And some people call this pantheism or panentheism, that God is in everything. So he doesn't negate the existence of God. He just says God is everywhere. God is in everything. Now you could say, well, isn't that kind of in the Bible? Yeah, it is. But you saw that God created this and he created that. Is God in that? And Maimonides would say, oh, well, God is the creator, and then kind of steps back and everything runs the way God wants it to. But Spinoza goes further in saying that there is no difference between God the creator and God's creations. God is in everything. Now, as I say this, even as I start to say this, most people would say, yeah, doesn't everybody kind of believe that? Well, yes and no. There are a lot of people who believe it, but there are a lot of people who believe it because Spinoza was one of the first people to articulate this. He was one of the first people who said, yeah, God is in everything. And that theology ends up having a huge impact on all forms of belief after, both for Jews and for Christians. He was excommunicated for that. The Jewish community threw him out of the community. They said, you can't be part of it. You can't come near us. We're not going to talk to you. You're not going to be buried. You're not in a Jewish cemetery. You're not going to be able to come into a synagogue. Now, interestingly, we know to some extent, I think some of us know, we made a mistake. But the Jewish community has never, they actually had a discussion in the Spanish Portuguese synagogue in Holland recently, whether they should reverse the excommunication, like you could do anything for him. And they said, no, we can't. We can't, because he rejected principles of Jewish faith that we can't change. We can't reverse what they did because they did it. The rabbis who did it 500 years ago had a justification to do it based on the way they understood God. So I'm going to show you a little bit. I'm going to show you briefly in this moment what this actually means as we've gotten to this part here, which is the Renaissance period, to the 17th century, to the Netherlands. And so we have, I'm going to share this. So I'm not going to do the whole thing right now necessarily, but I want to move through and explain this. So as I give it to you, as I said, I'll post this. So Maimonides, says that God is utterly transcendent and unknowable. We can only speak about what God is not, right? And as I said, around that time, we start to see the Kabbalistic ideas that God manifests in the world through mystical emanations that connect the infinite, Ein Sof, to creation. And then we get to Spinoza, who's developing and exposed to both of these ideas because he was a Sephardic Jew. God is the infinite substance of the universe. God and nature are one. Deus sive natura. They're the same. Now again, this might make that may make sense to you, may not. I know, right? How is that controversial? Controversial. Well, it was. And it was controversial because it broke the mold, which is one of the reasons why, again, Spinoza, a lot of people are saying, gosh, he's a Jewish hero. So again, you can see the text that kind of, summarizes these ideas. And again, Maimonides says we should not say that God is powerful, but rather that he is not weak, that he is wise. No, I shouldn't say that, but he's not ignorant. He believed in constantly using the what God isn't, because if we start to say that God is that, then we've defined God, we've made God, we've reduced God to something that is limiting God. Again, the Zohar is not the opposite. It's concerned with a different issue, which is, again, how do we access, how do we recognize God? And one of the things that we read about there, again, is this idea of the Ein Sof, of God's unending and completely infinite existence that is going to coalesce into one moment, into one atom, and then it then is to some extent refracted back out through the rest of the universe through the spherot. And again, looking at the text from Spinoza's most famous work, The Ethics, whatever is in God, and nothing can be nor be conceived without God. So these are all Jewish ideas. And I would say they're all connected. People look at them as kind of different, but they're really a development, if you will. You can see the relationship to the world and God's nature, these two things. There's people trying to figure out, but how do we understand God? How do we know God? What's God's relationship with the world? And again, to some extent, then what is the goal, right? For Maimonides, was purified belief from anthropomorphism, that God shouldn't be like a person, which again, you can understand for a Jew that's writing in an Islamic court. For Muslims, he wants to get home the fact that, hey, we're not responsible for God being a man. It's not our idea. God is not a man. And that we should use, like you do, and like we all should do as good people, we should use our intellect and we should make sure we're doing the right thing. For Kabbalah, it's really to draw closer to God so that we can feel God's presence and so that we can be in union with God, so that we can feel that energy through us, right? And this becomes a big part of Jewish ideas as we, again, as out of Tzfat, out of the Kabbalistic ideas that move from the Sephardic Jews, as Jews start coming to Israel from all over the world in the 1700s, in the 16 and 1700s, 17th, 18th century. They come to Tzfat, and that's where Ashkenazi Jews from Europe, Eastern Europe, from Poland and Russia, start to be exposed to these Kabbalistic ideas, because they really did come out of Spain. I mean, again, some of them are in the Torah, but these ideas of Sfirot, these ideas of this energy, this divine energy, these really came out of Sephardic community. We have to really give credit to the Sephardic community for developing Kabbalistic. And then, of course, again, when we look at Spinoza's goal, it's to live in harmony with nature, with God, through reason and understanding, which to some extent, of course, has a little bit of Maimonides in there, which is reason and understanding, right? And there also is this idea of feeling that and feeling that harmony, which is, I think, also Kabbalistic, the Kabbalistic idea. Now, of course, this leads us, and again, I'm sensitive to time today, but I also want to tell you that we're going to look at what I kind of gave it away. We start to talk about when Ashkenazi Jews get connected to this idea of Kabbalah and mysticism, that we start to have what we would call the Hasidic experience. And Hasidism definitely, completely, fully embraces the Kabbalistic ideas and then takes them another step. Makes them very European and very much like we would say. God is everywhere. God is in all aspects of our life. And we're supposed to access that through joy, through singing, through eating, through doing everything we do every day. And that we can cleave to God. We can attach ourselves to God in something called devekut, which is by telling stories, by praying, by dancing, that we have a chance to attach ourselves to God and feel that energy and actually experience it. It's not even like, well, we got to be rational about this. It was like, we're just going to feel it. We're going to experience it. Now, most people don't think about that. At the time when Hasidism started really as a movement by the Baal Shem Tov in Europe in the 1700s, this was a radical departure. And a lot of Jews who were traditional Jews felt uncomfortable with it. I want you to understand that it was so uncomfortable for some of our ancestors that they excommunicated the Hasidic Jews. They literally said, you're not part of the community. They did the same thing that the Sephardic Jews did to Spinoza. They excommunicated Hasidic rabbis. They said, you have gone too far. You're telling people that they can sing and dance instead of pray, they said, no, we're not saying you don't, but you can do this too. It was too much for some of the traditional rabbis in Eastern Europe, and they excommunicated them. They were the equivalent. I know this is going to sound strange, but Hasidic Jews theologically presented a challenge to the more, the Hasidic Jews called them the mitnagdim, the opposing people. That's what the mitnagdim were, the opposition. They basically said, no, Judaism isn't about that. It's about following the laws. It's about keeping kosher. It's about keeping Shabbos. Why are you worried about singing and dancing? And they really looked at them like they were hippies. I mean, the equivalent of like flower children. They literally said, you're nuts. And in some cases, it was pretty bad. Get out of our town. So it had a huge effect, though, especially in the southern part of the Jewish world at that time. We called the Pale of Settlement, especially in the areas of Galicia, in Ukraine and in Poland, in that area. Whereas the northern Jews were a little bit more leaning towards the Mitnagdim, the Litvak Jews, who literally said, no, this is crazy. You can't do this. And so there was a little bit of a difference between the northern European, Central European Jews and the southern European Jews, who were considered to be a little less observant, if you will, and a little bit more Hasidic, a little bit more. And we don't think about that today because we see Hasidic Jews as observant Jews and non-observant Jews as kind of like Reformed Jews, whatever. That's not the way it was. Our ancestors chose one or the other. You're either going to be more observant or you're going to be more Hasidic. But there really was we're not going to do nothing. So Hasidic Judaism really had a huge impact on Judaism, and somewhat because of the Holocaust, most of the Jews who opposed Hasidic Judaism were wiped out. Most of the Jews who were Hasidic were also wiped out. It didn't really matter. The Nazis didn't care. But some of the Hasidic dynasties were able to move to Israel or to move to America, and they survived. The most important and most famous one, of course, is Chabad. But they were lucky. Most of the Hasidic dynasties were wiped out, completely destroyed. But the impact is still felt by us today. Now, at the same time, I'm skipping a little ahead to the Holocaust, that's where we're going to kind of finish now. But of course, the Enlightenment and the breaking down of the barriers between the Jewish world and the Christian world, or the general world, meant that Jews were now starting to really deal with kind of like, well, what do we do? Are we rational? Are we going to be scientific? Do we approach secular knowledge at the same level as we approach the Torah? Do we teach our kids science or do we teach them Torah? And so Jews struggle with that. They say, no, we'll teach them both for the most part. And so this embracing of modern society, and especially now, the idea that there can be a secular approach to it, which is non-religious completely, really poses a challenge because you don't have to be anything. Because during the time of when Hasidism started in the 1700s, you had to pick. I'm going to be Hasidic or I'm not going to be Hasidic. But by the 1800s, late 1800s, 1900s, there's no more ghettos. There's no more necessarily, Jews don't have to live in shtetls anymore after the early 1900s. The Soviet, the Soviet Union completely obliterated religion and the differences between people living in a shtetl. And so that kind of life is over. Now you really are forced to make a decision. Do I want to be religious at all? I can be communist. I don't have to be religious at all. I can be part of society and I can completely reject it. So all of these things have a huge effect on Judaism and on our theology. And then in this period, and it's before the Holocaust, I want to make sure I just kind of skipped ahead to the fact that these people were all, unfortunately, all the people who inherited this stuff were murdered, that we have Jews that are starting to try to say, well, but how do we maintain a Judaism in the face of modern existence? And one of the most famous of those people was a guy by the name of Martin Buber. And Martin Buber was a German Jew who was very famous for his take on, you could see when he lived. He lived over that period. So he survived the Holocaust, but his world of Germany was destroyed. But he was very influenced by existentialism. And he started defining, and you really can't talk about Jewish theology without talking about Buber. He was also, by the way, a great collector of Jewish storytelling. So he has his book on Hasidic tales is like the classic book on Jewish storytelling. So he was raised by Hasidic grandparents, and he had a knowledge of that world and appreciation for it. But he also was a German Jew who understood science and went to the greatest universities at the time. And he was influenced by Kierkegaard and several of the kind of German and Scandinavian philosophers who started really saying, look, we live in a modern world. And, to define existentialism in one sentence, our world is absurd. Our world is really tough to deal with. And does it make any sense? And so, there's lots of people who could describe existentialism necessarily better than that, but the absurdity of the world that we live in is part of it. And the existence that we have, the real existence that we have, and what we would call authentic life is what we have to deal with. And that's what Buber tried to do, is try to explain our theology, or Jewish theology, and maybe again, you shape it and explain it in those terms. And he defined, this is, again, in a nutshell, a very quick way, again, we could spend weeks just talking about Buber, is that most people kind of can understand God in one of two ways. One is the very common way, and again, some would say it's maybe a traditional way, is I and it. We relate to God and we relate to objects and to things in the world as other things, as objects, things to be used, described, or controlled. There's another approach, which he called the I-thou. And this is a very important concept for people who are not even Jewish, who follow Buber's kinds of teachings, which says that when we meet another, whether it's a human being, an animal, anything that we encounter in the world, or God, we approach it not as something that is different from us or separate from us, but connected to us. And that again, God is the eternal thou. So when we say I, thou, if we meet a person, maybe we'd say they're a lowercase t, but the thou that's God is a capital T. It's the eternal other. And it is most famously summarized in this line from him. In every thou we address, we also speak also to the eternal thou. Through every particular thou, we address the eternal, which cannot be limited. And so, very much like some of the ideas that Spinoza teaches, he understands that God is not just in the other thing that we connect with, but in the connection itself. And through that connection, through that I thou relationship, which he called it, is that's that's holiness. And what's the goal here? What are we talking about? Cultivating those moments, authentic moments, moments where we feel God's presence. And whether we encounter God and whether we encounter the thou on an authentic relationship through prayer or through connections with other people or through justice or concepts of compassion, this is a way that we experience God. And every time we experience that, even if it's with an animal, let's say, we're experiencing the relationship with that animal, but we're also experiencing that experience with God. And so this was kind of, again, if you want to put it on the chart with Spinoza, it's also influenced by Spinoza, but it's also influenced by Kierkegaard and other philosophers at the time who are really trying to understand how do we connect with God, and how do we connect with God in the modern world? Because by the 1920s, we're talking about, look, we know we have cars, we even have planes by the time that Buber's writing some of this stuff. So people can start imagining, and again, we have Einstein, and so Einstein and Buber knew each other. They were friends. I guess you can say they were friends. I mean, they interacted, and they definitely are talking about how to understand God in these relationships. And to some extent, if you read Einstein, and Einstein did talk about God, Einstein did believe in God, he really believed in very much a kind of a Spinoza version of God, and I would even argue more a Buber understanding of God. And again, it's not a coincidence. They came out of Germany. They came out of the same intellectual groups that they were very similar, and of course they both survived the Holocaust. Buber survived by coming to Israel, and Einstein, of course, survived by coming to the United States. So, with that, we're going to finish with the last pieces, which is, if that's the 1920s, we're really, really close to the Holocaust, and it's impossible to talk about God as Jews without talking about the Holocaust. It's just impossible. You can't do it. And so it would be disingenuous to talk about God without talking about the Shoah. And one of the things that came out of the Holocaust were theologies that definitely are with us today. Some people would say that, again, there can't really be a Jewish theology, without talking about the Holocaust. And one of the most, again, this is going to be on the Read More About It page, which I'll share in a second. One of the most important theologians of the Holocaust period, and a survivor, somebody who actually spent time in the camps, and nowhere near as much as some of the other people who were affected by it. People like Viktor Frankl, who became an amazing therapist because of his experience. But his name was, and he was actually a Rabbi Emil Fackenheim. And Fackenheim ended up living out his life in the United States and in Europe. But he's very famous for what he called the 614th commandment. A lot of people know we have 630 commandments in the Torah. His 614th commandment, you may have heard. And he said, Jews must affirm our identity in God, otherwise we hand Hitler a posthumous victory. And he most famously, we can't hand Hitler a posthumous victory. Now, there were some people who were opposed to this idea. They thought, we can't, especially in the last 20 years, can't define Judaism through the Holocaust. You can't say we're Jews because of the Nazis or because of Hitler. I agree, but you can't not talk about God with that. So again, his famous line is, "We're forbidden to deny God. We must respond to Auschwitz by affirming God, though we do so in fear and trembling." And so he didn't say we don't believe in God anymore. He just says our relationship with God has changed, and he was one of the first theologians, one of the first Jews to talk openly about what it means to be Jewish, and most importantly, what does it mean not just to think about the mitzvot or our community, right? Not just Torah and Israel, but what does it mean to think about God in the face of the Holocaust? He's not the only one. And there were people, as I said, who reacted to him and who said, no. One of the most famous is a Jewish philosopher named Richard Rubinstein, who wrote a book called After Auschwitz. And he said that, and as a person who was proud of his Judaism, he said, that God is dead, right? That you can't believe in the God of the Bible anymore. It just can't happen. You can't believe in that God anymore. So Jews must find meaning in other things. And it's kind of, if you will, a post-God theology, which is there's no God, but we're not going to stop being Jewish. It's a tough thing to stomach. And again, I would say it's not very popular. You don't hear a lot of people talking about Richard Rubinstein anymore. But he said, the thread uniting God and man, heaven and earth, has been broken. We live in the time of the death of God. And that's what he said. And people were challenged by that. It's not going to say that they just said, oh, he's wrong. They said, well, what does that mean? And there is a Jewish theologian and a rabbi who has had a profound effect on lots of people, even though a lot of people don't know him, but he's still, thank God, alive, and he's still writing, and he just wrote another book recently. His name is Yitz Greenberg, Irving Greenberg. He's from New York. And he wrote, kind of in response to Rubinstein and these other rabbis and philosophers writing about the Holocaust, he said, God's covenant continues, but in voluntary partnership. After Auschwitz, God no longer guarantees protection. The covenant is now a mutual risk. And so he basically said, it's our choice to be part of the covenant now because God has rewritten the rules to some extent by allowing the Holocaust to happen. And so he famously said, his summary of this line, I think, his quote that summarizes that, he says, after the Holocaust, no statement, theological or otherwise, should be made that would not be credible in the presence of burning children. He's an Orthodox rabbi. And so he says, I'm not going to deny that Richard Rubinstein makes a very good point, but we're not going to reject God. We just have to understand that any statement we make about God has to be taking that into consideration in the Holocaust. You can't ignore it. And you can't make statements about it. And that's one of the reasons why I'm very careful. Thank God we still have some Holocaust survivors with us. I just talked to one today. You could probably guess which one. But I'm very careful. And this one in particular has, depending on the day, of different theological conversations with her. But I never, ever would have the audacity to tell somebody who's a Holocaust survivor who watched their families be murdered, who watched their families get taken to concentration camps. I would never tell them, never have the audacity to say, how can you not believe in God? How could you believe in God? How can you say anything? What am I supposed to say to somebody who's lived through that? I can't make a theological statement to them. It would be so inappropriate for me to say that. What do I know? I've never had anything like that in my life. Yeah.
There's God was given away from God through the Holocaust Jews. But we don't see that after October 7th.
We're going to get to that. I promise you, that's actually what we're finishing with, because we're finishing up now, folks. But I want to tell you, one more person that we need to mention. Unfortunately, he just passed away, but he had a tremendous effect on Jewish theology, talking about God, and not just Jews, because his book is one of the few books written by a rabbi that's ever become a bestseller. And of course, I'm talking about Harold Kushner, who wrote When Bad Things Happen to Good People. Not why bad things happen to good people, but when bad things happen. And he wrote that God, God good. I believe in a good God, but I don't believe in an omnipotent God in the classical sense, right? He wrote the book not because of the Holocaust, though he lived post-Holocaust. He lived, I mean, he was born before the Holocaust, but he was a child. But he wrote it because of his own son's death from progeria, which is a horrible illness. He watched his son age in front of him and basically die in his arms as a child, as a young child. And so he couldn't make sense of a world where this would happen. So he's writing really about from his personal experience. And he wrote, I can worship a God who hates suffering, but cannot abolish it. But I cannot worship a God who chooses to make children suffer. And that comes out of a place of personal experience. And what he did is he helped people come to terms with a God that we can understand doesn't stop things like the Holocaust. He's not writing about the Holocaust. He's writing about things that we all experience, which are really difficult things. And to answer, again, to what Philip just brought us back to, which is that every one of us is going to understand God in a somewhat different way, right? Every one of us, again, how could I, as I said at the very outset, how can I begin to talk about God and without, giving my own feelings and not being appropriate? And as I showed you at the beginning, again, we're a little bit over, I apologize, but we covered a lot, a lot of territory. As I said, I'll give you everybody these pages that you can have. I'm going to post them, actually, the link, because now we have enough text. I'm going to post them up on our website. They'll be up on the TBA website under the classes, under TBA Online, which is where our classes are, the links. And the links for each class will be there with these pages, because as I said, I made not only a page, I'll just show real quick. I made a page with this is sorry, this is the read more about it page. Wait a second, why is it not here? It's this page. We'll have the links to the other articles that you can read. So if you want to read, it's not working. If you want to read those pages, we'll pop them up. Let me just try one more time. Nope. Wait. There it is. There it is. We will we'll have those, but I'm going to show you one more thing, and that is, so this is what we read about today, some of the people. I want to show this, which is part of our prayer book, and this is the Amidah. This is a prayer we do all the time. And as you notice, again, the translations I said, we use praise be our God instead of, praise be He, God of our fathers and our mothers, because we follow the Reform tradition of saying Elohei Avotenu v'Imotenu. But here's the thing, and this is, you saw it in what God said to Moses at the burning bush. I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And of course, we add God of Sarah, God of Rebekah, God of Leah, and God of Rachel. But what's so interesting about this is what God says to Moses and what we say every day when we say 3 times a day when we're supposed to say the Amidah, that we say the words Elohei Avraham, Elohei Yitzhak, Elohei Yaakov, Elohei. We say the words God of Sarah, God of, we say those words God of. Now, wouldn't it make much more sense to say God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Sarah, Rebekah, Leah, and Rachel? That's the way you do it, so you don't have to repeat the word Elohei every time. Elohei Avraham, Elohei Yitzhak. You just say Elohei Avraham, Yitzhak, Yaakov. And so the rabbi said this 2,000 years ago, not last week, not 20 years ago, in an attempt to try to sound New Agey. They said every one of our ancestors in the Bible experiences God a different way. So the God of Abraham was not the God of Sarah. The God of Isaac was not the God of his wife Rebekah. The God of Jacob was not the same for him as it was to his parents or grandfather or to his mother or to his wife, or wives in this case. God appeared to each one of them differently. And so we have to say Elohe because that God was different. That was a different experience that each person had, which of course means that every person has a different experience with God. Each one of us does. So that the person that we sleep in bed with every night is not experiencing God the same way we do. And Judaism understands that. So we understand, again, we come to the end where we talk about these people, Buber, Spinoza, Maimonides, all of these people, but more importantly, you and I. Every one of us is going to experience God a different way. And for me to tell you how I experience God, or for you to tell me how you experience God, it might be a great way of sharing it, and we might learn a little bit from each other, but it's not the way it's going to happen. And for us to presume that our experience of God is going to be the same is understanding something that, again, the Bible tells us, our prayers tell us, and again, whether it's Spinoza or one of the other more modern philosophers, you will experience God a different way. And if I tell you that you'll experience God one way, I'm lying to you because I'm only telling you the way I've experienced God, which is why I don't ever say this is the way to experience God or this is the way you have to experience God. And of course, I don't like to hear it when I hear other people saying it either. But I have no control over anybody but myself. And I will tell you, you will not hear me ever say, this is the way God is, this is what God is. And it's one of the things that I love about Judaism, and it's one of the things that makes Jewish theology or talking about God so exciting and interesting, is that all we can do is share different possibilities, and then again, make everybody feel comfortable in the way they experience God. So thank you, everybody, for being again with us to define the undefinable. I promise that in the coming classes, there's going to be more information that you can actually say, oh, that's a fact. I don't know. Yeah, I think there'll be a lot more information and facts, but there were a lot of information and facts. But this was again an attempt to give us an overview, a survey of Jewish of our relationship with God. I even hate to use the word theology because it's a fancy way of saying but the study of God. And we don't study God really in Judaism. We try to experience God. So thank you, everybody, for this experience and for this authentic moment that we spent together, to use the Buber's language, to try to have as many authentic moments as we can. So, and again, to have as many joyous experiences as we can, according to our more recent Hasidic teachers, that we experience God in joy and in good things. So we'll see you in the coming days. And if we don't see you until next Wednesday, we'll see you next Wednesday night back here, the same bat time, bat channel. All right. Bye.
Rabbi,
Thank you,
Diane, it was
Rabbi.
great to have you.
thank you. What website exactly can I?
It's going to be on the Temple Beth and Me website. So under TBA Online, I'm going to post these things. Okay. So I'll post all the articles, the charts that I made up, and then the links to read more about it. So thank you, everybody, for being here tonight. And thank you, Diane. It was great to see you from far away. We're not that